We're here with Oleksiy Sorokin from the Kyiv Independent. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The Ukrainian government has just declared a state of emergency. Could you explain to us what that consists of and what preparations and actions are being undertaken in Kyiv?
Basically, right now, the government has the right to impose curfew, to impose martial law, to restrict traveling. The main issue here is Ukraine is imposing basically a state in which it can react quickly to any further escalation. We know that the Ukrainian army will most likely now protect key infrastructure in Kyiv and around Ukraine as well.
Have people been supportive of this declaration?
I think yes, most people do support the army, the government. We know that a lot of people are now giving money to charities and volunteers who support the army. One of them is called Stay Alive and has collected around $1 million just yesterday. That's similar to what they received in 2021.
Wow. And are people starting to evacuate the city? Are people digging in and preparing to defend themselves? What's sort of the mood in the city?
I would say that people don't panic yet. Obviously, everyone is cautious. Everybody is worrying. My friends, my family who doesn't follow the news is worried. People in bars and cafes, they are constantly now checking the news. So the situation is very harsh, it's depressing, but I wouldn't say that there's a panic and not a lot of people are leaving the city.
Gotcha. And I've heard that there have been some cyber attacks on banks and government websites. Has that affected day-to-day life? Are you expecting any more of these cyber attacks in the coming days and weeks?
Yes, just today we experienced yet another cyber attack. Most government websites were offline for 2 hours. The Ministry of Digital Transformation issued a statement saying that they expect further attacks. And Ukraine is constantly living under escalation, under threat, and under pressure. Ukrainian hryvnia today peaked at 30 hryvnias per $1, which is a record high since the start of the war. So we expect attack all over, from cyber, from economic pressure, and obviously we expect further military escalation as well.
And in terms of the military escalation, has there been a significant increase of shelling into Ukraine since this invasion began, 24, 48 hours ago?
Well, we see that since February 18th, the shelling has increased drastically. It's one of the worst situations since 2015, 2016. We witnessed 60 to 100 shellings per day. We know of 5 people killed. We know tens of people injured. Houses, kindergartens, schools are being constantly under fire. So the situation is getting worse day by day.
Gotcha. And has there been any change in the front lines yet? Have you seen Russian troops mobilizing towards the front lines, and how many troops have entered Ukraine at the moment?
Well, we know that Russia currently has around 160 to 200,000 troops on Ukrainian borders, meaning in occupied Crimea and occupied Donbass and in Belarus as well. There's multiple reports that Russia is about to officially enter the occupied Donbass. As of this minute, we don't have a confirmation, but just now the head of the Russian-controlled militant group in Donetsk Oblast said basically that Ukrainian army has to leave Donbass, or he promises consequences. We don't know what that is going to be, but we expect that Russian military would definitely get involved.
Um, and so obviously the US, European countries, a bunch of other countries across the world have imposed sanctions. Do you feel that these sanctions are going to be effective in inflicting any sort of economic hardship on Russia? And do you think that they'll be effective in preventing any further attacks?
I think Vladimir Putin doesn't care about sanctions. I think if he decides to launch a full-scale invasion, sanctions won't stop him. But it's important to punish the Russian regime and make it costly for them. That helps Ukraine, that helps Ukrainian army, and that helps to defend our country. Because obviously, we understand that if Russia launches a full-scale invasion, then they will be able to overrun the country.
So what steps would you like to see the US and NATO take in order to help Ukraine in this situation?
I would say that the first step was good, putting sanctions on Nord Stream 2, canceling this pipeline. Second, we want to see sanctions imposed on Russian elites, Russian oligarchs. We want to see Russian cash frozen in places like London, Frankfurt, and other major business capitals. We also want to see pressure and sanctions on Russian state companies so that Russian elites, those near Vladimir Putin, they witness the steps and they witness pressure from the West. So it has to be costly for Russia and those people around Putin.
Do you think that the military support is enough? Would you like to see more military aid from the US and NATO?
Obviously, we're very grateful for support from the UK and the US. Anti-tank missiles, financial assistance, and everything that can help Ukraine defend itself is very good. It helps us because we understand that the Ukrainian army, even though right now it's prepared, it still requires help from the West. We would like to see more arms. We understand that the US, Canada, and the United Kingdom can provide us with arms, and we expect them to increase it. We want to see a type of land lease. We want to experience full support of the world because we understand that the states and NATO won't fight for Ukraine. We understand that nobody's going to send troops to Ukraine. But I think that right now the whole world has to do everything it can to protect Ukraine, a striving democracy currently facing a full-scale war with an authoritarian regime.
Yeah. And President Biden has said that he is still hoping that there's a path to diplomacy. He's consistently said that, the door for diplomacy is always open. Do you think there is a diplomatic way to solve this crisis, to get Russia out of Ukraine, or do you think that time has passed?
I think the door has closed. Why I think that way? Because the speech that President Putin made a couple of days back, where he basically denied Ukraine the right to exist, I think that was a speech that he prepared for months, maybe years. It looked like a speech that he was willing to make from the start of the war in 2014. So I think he made up his mind. I think he will further escalate. The question now is at what point he will stop. Will there be an escalation in Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts? Or is he ready to go all in and invade Ukraine from other regions as well?
And sort of going into his speech there, what were the reasons he was giving for why he wanted to take this territory, and sort of what was the tone of that speech?
Well, according to Putin, Ukrainian nation doesn't exist. According to him, Ukraine was invented by Russia. He feels that the breakup of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of this empire, was a tragedy. It was a mistake, basically, conducted by Soviet leadership, and he believes that he's the one who can gather Russian territory. He saw how easy it was for him to annex Crimea. The West didn't do much. Ukraine also didn't resist. And now he feels that he can go further. He can occupy more land. And I hope he's wrong. And I hope that the world will support Ukraine in this fight.
Do you think that the resistance, both from the global community and from Ukraine, is different from 2014? And in what way have you seen that difference, if there is one?
Yes, I think that finally the world woke up. I feel that the support that Ukraine is getting right now, both diplomatic, military support, is much, much bigger than it was in 2014. I think back then the world wasn't ready for a full-scale war in Europe. Now, with this ongoing escalation, the world is ready. I would say that Ukraine as well is better prepared. The Ukrainian army in 2022 is much more capable of fighting Russian troops than it was in 2014. So I would say that if Russia launches a full-scale invasion, it will have a much harder time moving forward. I think that the Russian leadership understands that there will be thousands of people dead if they launch a full-scale invasion. And I hope that this notion that Ukraine will resist and that the West is united behind Ukraine, it will make those in the Kremlin actually think twice before launching something big.
Yeah, and if they do end up going forward with this full-scale invasion throughout Donbass and throughout the rest of Ukraine, are you expecting refugees moving towards the west of the country into Europe? Do you see that happening, or do you think people will remain in their homes and either fight or try to stay through an occupation?
Well, obviously, there will be some refugees. If we're looking at current polls, then over 50% of Ukrainians are ready to fight. Some picking up arms, others providing aid to the army or the territorial defense units. So most Ukrainians will resist, most Ukrainians will fight, but obviously if something major happens in the next week, then the European Union and Ukrainian neighbors must be ready for a new refugee crisis similar to that of 2015, 2016.
And it sounds like the Ukrainian people are fairly united in opposition to this, ready to fight. Do you think that this has made people in Ukraine more likely to want to join NATO? Has it stirred up that sentiment, or has it just sort of reinvigorated Ukrainian nationality and national spirit?
Well, yes, I think Russian invasion 2014 basically shaped the Ukrainian nation because if we were looking at polls prior to Russian invasion, then the country was divided between those who want closer ties with Russia and those who want to join NATO. Similar numbers were for the European Union. Now, according to latest polls, we see over 65% of Ukrainians willing to join NATO, the European Union, And even in cities that some thought would be a bit pro-Russian or maybe keen to underestimate Russian threat, they have moved forward saying that no, we will resist. We know what Russia will do, and we're ready to defend our city, our homeland. We know that, for example, the city of Mariupol in Donbass, which is currently under the Ukrainian flag, it's ready for a fight. There's a Ukrainian army stationed there. There is people who are ready to pick up arms. So I would say that Vladimir Putin, with this invasion, he united Ukrainians in their strive for NATO and the European Union. And with his current demands of Ukraine never joining NATO, it's impossible to achieve because the majority of the country now desires to join the alliance.
And you've said that this invasion has united Ukraine. Do you feel politically that all the parties in Ukraine are sort of united in this as well, or have any parties, sort of taken a different stance?
Well, if we're talking about the domestic politics of Ukraine, then even before this escalation, the ceiling for a Kremlin-friendly political party would have been 10 to 15%. Currently in the parliament, we have one party who's seen as pro-Kremlin. It's called the Opposition Platform, and that's about it. We know that pro-Russian sentiment is highly unpopular in Ukraine. So even before this escalation, I would say that most Ukrainian political parties, they can have their differences, they can argue on domestic issues, but when it comes to Russia, they're fairly united.
I think we just lost your video. Do you think President Zelensky has handled this situation appropriately?
I recently had a debate with one of my colleagues. I personally think that Zelensky is doing a good job. I have many questions concerning his domestic policies, but I would say that right now he's handling the situation to the best of his abilities. He has been conveying proper messages. He has been taking proper steps. He publicly does everything he needs to do. But now the question will be how he will handle the situation when Russia further escalates. And personally, I have faith in the Ukrainian president.
And if the situation continues to escalate and Russia pushes further into Ukraine, are you worried about your safety and the safety of other journalists in Ukraine?
Obviously, all Ukrainian news outlets, they already have contingency plans. They have plans of evacuation in case major crisis, in case of full-scale Russian invasion. We understand that Russia is an authoritarian regime where journalists are prosecuted, and especially during wartime, activists, journalists, politicians will be the first target of Russia if it moves in. So we have to keep that in mind. We have to protect our families. But again, our job as journalists is to cover this crisis on the ground. So for me personally, and for many of my colleagues, evacuation and leaving will be the last resort.
And so I think you've mentioned the fight between democracy and autocracy. It's something President Biden has spoken about as well. Some in media in the US have said that Ukraine is not a democracy. How do you respond to claims like that?
Well, that's absurd. I think that plays well into Russian propaganda. I think everyone who mentioned this, especially some folks from one particular network, they play into the Russian narrative. Ukraine is a democracy. We have free elections. We have freedom of the press. We have basically freedom of speech. But obviously, right now, we're facing a country, an enemy that is opposed to everything what I just mentioned. And so many in Ukraine feel that we're not only fighting for Ukraine, for our country, but we are fighting for our way of life. We are fighting for the whole idea that a person can decide his own future. And that's why I think that the world has to support Ukraine right now.
Is there something that you think international media is not seeing on the ground or is not reporting about the situation?
I think it's a must for foreign media to talk, to interview to local residents, to people on the ground, to those who have been living with Russia as a neighbor for their whole life, who witnessed war for the past 8 years. Because I've been asked a lot why Ukrainians don't panic, why there's no empty shelves, why nobody is leaving. Because we are at war for the past 8 years. Russia occupied Donbass, Russia occupied Crimea, Russia killed over 13,000 people and killing people every day. Just in the past couple of days, 5 people lost their lives. And that's why we're not panicking, because we're ready for what's happening and we know what Russia is capable of.
Is there anything else that that you think, especially an American audience who's going to be listening to this should know?
I think the most important message here to the American audience is that the US often says that it fights for democracy, it fights for freedom, it supports those who are oppressed. I think to prove this and to show the world that the states are a world power, a global policeman, supporting Ukraine right now is a must. And we in Ukraine are grateful for the support coming from the US and the UK. We obviously want more. And I think it's in the interest of the US to provide more arms, more financial assistance, and impose tougher sanctions on Russia.
Great. I think that was all I have, unless there's something else that you'd like to add.
No, I think I said everything I know on this moment.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.